Pat enjoyed her work with the deaf, managing special educational schools throughout the province. She was enjoying a few days alone at the family's summer cottage when there was a late-night knock on the screen door. There stood a police officer. Her first fear was quieted. Her 16-year-old son, Matt, was fine. She was asked to go to the police station back home. They gave no explanation. Pat was grilled for hours about her husband.
So on my way home, I was questioned and got into some personal relation issues. I couldn't quite figure out why they would not tell me what had happened. They did.
The questioning and interrogation went on for hours.
And then I had to make a videotape statement, still not knowing what had happened to him.
Finally, Pat is told that her husband, Murray, is dead. In excruciating detail, she hears a horrific, unbelievable story of violence and brutality. The details of the story imprint in her mind's eye. Then Pat realizes that the police are treating her as a suspect in her husband's murder. As difficult to believe as Murray, a loving and quiet man with no enemies, being severely beaten with his throat slit and left in a back alley in their quiet town. Eventually, over time, another story emerges. A youth possibly strung out on drugs, and Murray in the wrong place at the wrong time.
The first thing Matt said to me on the second day, when we were at least able to function a little bit, was, "We have to follow Dad's wishes." He wanted to be cremated.
But Pat's agony isn't over. The body is evidence for the trial and may not be cremated. Devastated, Pat fights the court ruling. Months later, she is denied. Finally, the courts give permission to bury him.
We couldn't put a headstone, which is another piece of closure I've learned. We couldn't put that because in case we wanted to disinter him and follow his wishes, if everything went quickly enough.
But nothing went quickly. Bringing the perpetrator to justice would take years. Pat needed closure. She and Matt finally agreed to lay the permanent base for the headstone.
So we did eventually, after 2 years, get to put a headstone there.
Now, 6 months later, Pat and Matt still cannot venture outside in the dark, not even to put out the garbage. Even in daylight, they can't go near the street where it happened. Pat struggled with depression, not able to work full-time for quite some time.
In the initial stages of an acute grief, you cannot separate depression and grief because the symptoms are identical. You're feeling overwhelmed, can't concentrate, can't sleep, lose thought control to a large extent in the initial stages. So personally, I cannot separate normal grief and depression if you're evaluating someone in that acute phase. The symptoms are identical.
For some, the normal grieving process becomes exacerbated. The usual symptoms of grieving, depression, sleep and appetite disturbances, reduced sex drive or preoccupation with the deceased, worsen over time.
Well, what I look for in my practice to tell if someone is entering depression rather than just normal grief is after 6 months, I start looking, can they control their thoughts? Is their concentration starting to come back? Do they feel more capable of working, social interaction? Does a sense of hope or being able to function starting to come back? So there are some people during acute grief are so overwhelmed, they actually become acutely suicidal. Like they want to join the departed relative, or they just feel totally hopeless. They can't function at all without the departed loved one. That is a medical emergency. So it is never normal to be suicidal.
It's not always that easy for people experiencing bereavement to move on from the grief, from the death experience. It's like when I meet clients who are involved in that kind of great difficulty in separating themselves from the partner who has passed on, I've often had to really back up and help them begin to look at the relationship that existed prior to the bereavement.
There are situations that cause the grief crisis to become exponentially more difficult and painful, like the loss of more than one person at the same time or within a short period of time. When someone experiences multiple losses, the intensity of the grief responses multiplies, creating more trauma than the body, mind, or emotions can manage, causing the grief processes to layer on top of one another.
all in a small period of time, haven't even had any time to begin to mourn one when, whew, there's another death come their way, or another big grief. We need not to say that grief is only attached to death. I mean, there can be a grief with divorce, there can be grief with financial loss, there can be with friendship. You know, any loss in our life is a grief in our life that we do have to mourn in some way. So sometimes people have many, many losses very close together. I think this constitutes complicated mourning because people don't have the time and can't focus on that particular loss and work through it. So now there's not one layer of loss, but maybe 6 layers of loss that are all running into one another in a very, very complicated and overwhelming time for people.
We will be driving down past the road that you turn on, and she just shakes.
Dissociation means a lack of connectivity between emotions, thoughts, feelings, impulses, and memories. So low-grade dissociation is highway hypnosis, driving one place to another and forgetting, where the last 10 kilometers went, and that's normal. More extreme dissociation implies loss of memory at the far end. Somebody in a grief situation is only going to be dissociative if they've had earlier trauma in their lives. So the present grief experience revealing the way they handle their trauma, which is splitting off from the experience of the pain and the suffering. So they may appear dazed, disoriented, confused, sleepless, nightmares, and have difficulty at the more extreme end with social or vocational functioning.
But we guess that somehow the stress of the event causes a disruption in brain chemistry in someone who's vulnerable. If they're traumatized in any significant way, in a mechanism that we don't understand, it could drop their serotonin levels even further and put them into greater or their initial clinical depression. So it is possible, but there are mechanisms we don't understand.
But as the years went on and as I came into understanding, like I was saying, of grief and of how huge the loss was, and I allowed myself to understand it, I began to realize that this loss in my life was much, much greater than just saying I lost a sister. I had, without doubt, lost a best friend. Without doubt, lost a mentor. Gwen was my role model.
When death occurs during or prior to significant milestones like Christmas or a birthday, the normal tasks of grief are multiplied. Sometimes death visits families in the middle of an inconsequential momentary conflict. Sometimes death can interrupt a long, ongoing, stalemated relationship. In either case, the survivor can be left with a residue of unresolved guilt, anger, sadness, or pain.
It was compounded by the fact that my mum developed dementia about a year before my dad died.
We think of homicide, different, very, very difficult accident scenes. This sort of thing can constitute very much a response of a complicated mourning as well. I think the elderly often have complicated mourning. They're losing everything. One thing after another. They lose their home, their spouse, their identity many times, a lot of friendships, their independence.
When death happens suddenly, without warning, the survivor is likely to experience post-traumatic stress disorder. Any sudden death is likely to be traumatic, but nothing so thorny as death caused by suicide or homicide. If the death is caused by suicide, violence, negligence, or murder, recovery is complicated.
For about 6 months, both Matt and I had trouble going out in the dark. And that went so far as to going out to put something outside. I still can't go down that street very easily. I avoid it at all costs if I can.
Yes, there's no doubt that physical symptoms can increase when someone is in any kind of emotional trauma. So this is true for depression, anxiety, grief, anything that affects your emotions intensely, Physical symptoms are very common.
No matter what your experience has been, it is critical to experience your feelings, not just for your own emotional welfare, but also for your physical well-being. When you deny the most powerful feelings known to humanity or become emotionally phobic, you create an insurmountable pressure in your physical body. Harboring unexpressed grief can cause physical illness. Death itself can be traumatizing. Research strongly demonstrates that trauma can trigger other emotionally, psychologically, and relationally sensitive areas that in turn wreak havoc on marriages, parenting, child development, self-esteem, and even addictive tendencies. It is certainly not uncommon for adults as well as children to experience depression and anxiety.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is a condition of extreme reactivity to trauma and loss. People either have heightened or diminished emotional symptoms. So on the positive side, people can suffer from panic attacks, nightmares, nervous symptoms, and upset stomachs and diarrhea and all that kind of thing. On the minus side, those would look like a diminished interest in life, a sense of a foreshortened future, a restriction from social activities, and avoiding the areas that might be associated with where those traumas or accidents happened.
Sleep is very important. If a person is not sleeping, they will get worse. This is true in regular depression. When there isn't a trauma, it's just a depression that comes on. If a person is not sleeping, they will not get better. Don't hesitate to take something for sleep if it's necessary, because you can't cope with anything without sleep. And then don't hesitate to lean on your support network. Don't hesitate to lean on your friends, lean on your church, lean on your faith group, lean on anyone. Don't consider it to be a weakness to, at this time of tremendous stress, lean on your supports. That's why your supports are there.
Grieving is an extremely stressful time, and the fallout of the experience can show up in different areas. Some of the signs that you may still have unresolved issues are a preoccupation with loss, the inability to talk about the loss, uncontrollable tearful spells, symptoms of trauma, ongoing depression, or a sense that you're really stuck and confused about the future.
Working through the many feelings surrounding the death of a loved one is crucial. There are things you can do to help you deal with what you need to and move ahead. You can talk about the lost relationship with all of its ups and downs with a counselor, clergy, or support group. Even the prescribed use of medication can be helpful to assist with sleeplessness, anxiety, or depression when needed. Although everyone's journey of grief recovery is unique, we hope you will watch for the 5 progress markers we spoke about in Chapter 3. You can ask yourself which markers you've incorporated into your story.
I want you to know that no matter how badly you feel right now, you can overcome the challenges of grief, and it is possible to go on to live a full and happy life again. I invite you to take the first step today. Believe that you will get through this. The journey might seem long and unbearable at times, and some of the mountains ahead are daunting. But if you gently lean forward into the hill, your heart will lead you, and you'll discover your feet will keep up.
As fellow sojourners, we can't promise it'll be easy, but your loved ones who have gone ahead, join us on the sidelines, firmly believing in you and cheering you on to finish, and to finish well. On behalf of Eyeglass Concepts, I want to thank you for allowing us to visit you in your home and welcoming us into the sacred space of your wounded heart. Thank you for traveling with us, and may God richly bless you and your family.
To find more aftercare resources and support for loss and grief, or to explore how to create a living multimedia and interactive memorial to honor your loved ones, visit the Eyeglass Concepts website at www.egcmemorials.com.